So to talk about the mind-body problem is really, in essence, to talk about the mind, right? And the nature of the mind. Because the nature of the body is pretty clear to us, right? It's the body, it's physical matter. The mind, however, it's not so clear what the mind is. Right? So what we're really doing in the mind-body problem is speculating on the mind's nature. And given what nature we conclude it or argue for, how this allows it to relate to the body, right? Or the body to relate to it. Uh, so what follows in this section of the lecture is four really, um, individual theories or stances on the mind-body problem, right? With a couple of sub-theories in the case of one of these broader um, positions. So we have dualism, which we've already talked about, that the idea that the mind and the body are completely distinct entities, right? They're radically different. And within dualism, Descartes' ultimate version of it is something called interactionalism. The idea that there is a point where the mind and body are bridged. Right? For Descartes, it was the pituitary gland. Don't ask why. I don't know. It seemed kind of a logical conclusion, I suppose. But the pituitary gland for Descartes bridges the immaterial mind with the physical body, kind of as a control center, if you will. It didn't even really fit with modern, with at his time's modern understanding of medicine. So I'm not entirely sure why he made that conclusion, considering how well versed he was in medicine. Right. Another version of dualism, one that we'll get into in more detail um, in the next lecture, is called phenomenalism. And phenomenalism is a version of dualism that says that yes, the mind and body are distinct, but what matters isn't how they interact, it's how the mind knows the rest of the world. Because in getting into how the mind knows the external world, you will, by that very course of action, solve how the mind interacts with the body. Right? Or at least you will know everything important regarding regarding their interaction. The second position is the second theory on the nature of the mind is a theory called idealism. And idealism says that there is only the mental, only the mind, that the physical is in fact product of the mental. This is to say that the physical is an emergent feature, right, of the mind, or a product of the mind, I should say. And we'll discuss two different philosophers who were idealists and their theories. And then the third version is materialism. Materialism is quite the opposite of idealism. Right? It's the exact opposite. It says that there is only the physical. In other words, the mind is just, uh, a product of, our body, whether that be the brain or the body as a whole, right? The mind is just physical processes. Now, there are three subcategories, kind of broad variations of materialism. The first is reductionism or eliminativism. And eliminativism just says that the mind is simply and only the neural activity, right? Or brain states, right? In other words, it's a reductionist theory of the mind, right? And the same way that you have the fictionalist theory of the self as a reductionist theory of identity, right? This is a reductionist theory of the mind. Right? The mind just reduces to neural activity. Eventually, functionally, we'll be able to find one-to-one brain states, right, or neural activities. Like these neurons are responsible for causing this sensation of purple or this sound, right? So the idea that we could stimulate the brain and get, you know, once we know everything about the brain, we can create our own experiences, right? That's reductionism or eliminativism. Right? The mind is just those neural activities. You also have epiphenomenalism as a version of materialism. And epiphenomenalism says that the mind, or the mental, is an emergent feature of those physical processes. Right? That beliefs come from neural activity, but they cannot be fully reduced back down to them. Right? That's not to say there's anything particularly special about the mental. It's just like telling time for on a watch involves um, is something more than all the parts that go into making the watch work. The mental things like our beliefs, our sensory experiences, and everything, they might come from the brain processing things, but they can't be reduced fully down to it. But that doesn't mean that they're special in any way either. Right? Uh, so what matters is going to be those physical processes that produce mental ones, but understanding that they can't be fully reduced down does separate it out from eliminativism. And then finally you have functionalism as the third broad subtype of materialism, which just says that the mind is comprised of a series of functions, right, like a computer. Another way of thinking about this is like our brain has specialized regions, right? Um, and things like language, the ability for language, are hardwired into us. Right? Without those language centers, we don't have language, and therefore we don't have a human mind. Right? So different parts of the mind, the brain, serve different functions, and and that's how it works, right? So the brain has various powers, if you want to get into it. If you want to put it another way, the brain has various powers, and it's just the exercise of these powers or their existence that the existence of a certain number of different functions or powers and their interaction that matters. Right? Um, And then the fourth theory, not fourth subtype of materialism, but the fourth theory of the mind is very different and one that we won't really get into in this course. And it's known as panpsychism. Panpsychism says that consciousness, right, is a fundamental force of the universe or nature. Right? So consciousness in this way is like strong or weak nuclear force, electromagnetic force, or gravity, right? It's a fundamental, it'd be like a fifth force of physics, right? Something that binds everything together. What differentiates or what matters is not that we have consciousness, that we have a mind, but the level of organization and everything needed for the degree of self-awareness. Right? The level of self-consciousness that we have. So the question should really be, how is it that we are as self-conscious as we are? And to what extent is the mind um, enhanced by the presence of a body, for lack of a better term?